November 24, 1944. The Pacific sky over Saipan burns with the light of dawn. 100 silver bombers rise from the island's coral runway, their engines howling like a promise. What if the weapon that ended the war was not a bomb, but a machine inside an engine? Over Tokyo, these planes would fly higher than fear, faster than reason. Their strength came from something invisible, the turbo supercharger, a device that turned wasted fire into power. While the world believed victory belonged to soldiers, it was actually forged in factories by unseen hands. At 32,000 feet, Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Morgan advanced the throttles of his B-29 Dauntless Doy. Beneath his feet, 8 turbines spun at 20,000 revolutions per minute, feeding life into the 4 roaring engines. In that moment, America's industrial heart beat louder than any gunfire. The Japanese command would soon learn the truth, that the war for the skies was already lost before a single bomb fell. This is the untold story of the machine that changed destiny, and how one invention helped shape the final chapter of World War II. The engines thundered across Saipan's dawn, echoing off the cliffs and the restless sea. One by one, the B-29s lifted into the golden light, their wings heavy with fuel and destiny. In each engine, nacelle, 2 small turbines spun with fury, unseen, unheard, yet more powerful than any weapon ever built. This was not just machinery. It was the sound of an idea made real, that science, not pride, would decide who ruled the skies. Half a world away in a gray room in Tokyo, officers of the Imperial Army pored over intercepted American reports. "Impossible," one of them muttered. "No engine can keep sea-level power above 20,000 feet." But even as he spoke, Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Morgan's bomber, Dauntless Doy, was climbing through 30,000 feet with ease. The secret lay within the heart of every engine, the turbo supercharger. Hot exhaust gases, once wasted, now spun turbine wheels at 20,000 revolutions per minute. The turbines drove compressors that packed the thin, icy air into the cylinders as if the engines were still breathing on the ground. 4 engines, 8 turbochargers, and one promise: dominance of the high skies. In America, this miracle had been born not in secret laboratories, but in factories humming day and night. At General Electric's plant in Schenectady, New York, engineers, men and women alike, calibrated turbine blades by thousandths of an inch. They measured metal not by weight, but by faith. Every blade had to be perfect, for at 30,000 feet, imperfection meant death. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and molten steel. Workers checked the turbines, balancing them until they spun silently, steady as the human pulse. When one blade vibrated too much, a woman named Evelyn Marks shut down the machine, polished it by hand, and began again. She had never flown in a bomber, but her fingerprints lived inside them. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Japanese engineers fought a losing battle against physics. They studied fragments of captured B-29 engines, trying to imitate the impossible. Fumio Niwa, a young aeronautical officer, examined a broken turbocharger recovered from a crashed bomber in China. His report, still preserved today, reads like a confession. "The Americans have built a turbine that our metal cannot withstand. Their alloy lives in fire. Ours dies in it." He was right. The turbine blades inside each American engine faced temperatures above 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Every rotation created forces equal to thousands of pounds per square inch. One microscopic flaw, a bubble in the metal, a crack invisible to the eye, would tear the engine apart. American industry had mastered metallurgy that could endure this punishment. Japan had not. Inside the B-29, the men hardly thought of the turbines beneath them. They trusted them as they trusted the sunrise. The pressurized cabin kept them warm, breathing easily, even as the world outside froze solid. Below them, the sea curved like glass. Ahead, Tokyo waited in silence. In Germany, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of military intelligence, had once warned his own command about America's growing industrial power. "You underestimate the machine," he said. "They build as they breathe." He had been ignored, called defeatist, and eventually imprisoned for his doubts. Yet his words now echoed across another empire that refused to listen. At 31,000 feet, the dauntless Doi leveled off. Morgan looked down at the instruments, all steady, all alive. Through the intercom, his co-pilot spoke softly, "Engines running smooth, sir. Turbos holding pressure." Morgan nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Good. Let's show them what altitude really means." Far below, Japanese radar operators tracked dots on their screens. "They are too high," one whispered. "Our fighters cannot reach them." Commanders ordered pilots into the air anyway. Ki-45s, Ki-61s, elegant machines, agile at medium height, but suffocating above 20,000 feet. Their oxygen systems froze. Their engines lost power. What had been aircraft became falling stars. One fighter pilot, Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura, clawed his way upward until the controls trembled in his hands. He saw the silver giants above him, glinting in sunlight, impossibly high. He fired, a short burst, a flash, and one bomber fell, trailing smoke. But his own engines overheated, coughing fire. He barely made it home. "The sky," he wrote later, "no longer belonged to us." Back in America, the workers at General Electric read newspaper headlines about the unstoppable super fortress. They did not see their own reflection in those words, but it was there. Every turn of the turbine was their signature, every mile of altitude their victory. The B-29 was more than a bomber. It was a flying declaration that industrial strength could outthink ideology. While the Axis powers worshipped willpower and sacrifice, America worshipped precision, and in that precision lay salvation. The Japanese High Command refused to admit defeat. "We will improve our engines," they insisted. But time was running out, and the factories could no longer keep pace with the sky. The empire had built temples for its gods of war, yet forgotten to build the tools of survival. By the winter of 1944, the balance of air power had shifted irreversibly. The silver bombers ruled the stratosphere, untouchable and unseen. And within every one of them, the quiet hum of a turbine reminded the world that technology, not faith, not fury, had become the new face of power in World War II. The first mission from China had been called the beginning of the end. On a humid June night in 1944, 75 B-29s lifted off from Chengdu, their engines roaring into the blackness. The journey to Kyushu was long, 1,500 miles of uncertainty, but the message was clear. Japan was no longer untouchable. Of those 75 planes, only 47 reached their target. 7 never came home. 1 was shot down, another destroyed in a crash landing, and the rest simply disappeared into the dark Pacific. 57 airmen died before seeing the sunrise. Yet even in loss, the truth became clear. Japan's defenses could not stop them. In the radar rooms on Kyushu, the screens flickered with approaching shadows. Alarms wailed across Yawata as the Imperial Army scrambled its fighters. Twin-engine Ki-45s clawed upward, their pilots gasping for breath. At 20,000 feet, their engines began to fade. At 25, they sputtered. Above 28,000, they died completely. One man, Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura, pressed on. The sky was thin, his oxygen tank nearly empty, but he caught sight of a silver shape above the clouds, a B-29 called Limber Dragon. He attacked in a desperate dive, riddling the bomber with fire until it vanished in a blossom of smoke. 12 men died in seconds. Kimura limped home, his cockpit filled with smoke, his engine boiling. It was his first victory, and it would nearly be his last. Back in Tokyo, military officials celebrated his success as proof that the empire could still fight. But behind the cheers, engineers knew the truth. Every flight above 20,000 feet was suicide. The engines that powered Japan's fighters were choking to death in the stratosphere. Colonel Takushiro Hattori wrote in his diary, "We cannot reach the Americans. They are like ghosts above the sky." Even when Japanese bullets struck their targets, the B-29s refused to fall. The bombers' armored bellies and redundant systems absorbed punishment that would have torn Japanese aircraft to pieces. In one terrifying report, Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the 244th Air Regiment confessed, "Our planes can climb but not fight. We reach them only to die beside them." For Japanese pilots, altitude became the enemy. Every meter upward drained their fuel, froze their fingers, and stole their strength. At 30,000 feet, the cockpit temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen masks froze solid, guns jammed, and when they fired, their shells drifted helplessly through thin air. Lieutenant Isamu Sasaki remembered looking down at Tokyo, far below, thinking, "We defend our homeland from the bottom of the sky." Meanwhile, in the factories of America, the miracle continued. At General Electric, new production lines rolled out thousands of turbo superchargers each month. Machines tested each turbine automatically, spinning them faster than any human eye could follow. If a single part wobbled, sensors detected the flaw and workers melted it down to begin again. No room for imperfection, no tolerance for error. The difference was not merely technological, it was industrial, cultural, human. In Japan, a single flawed batch of steel could cripple a month's production. In America, a single shift produced more engines than Japan could build in a season. The empire was running out of both metal and men. In late 1944, Japanese engineers finally assembled a prototype high-altitude interceptor, the Nakajima Ki-87. It was beautiful on paper, a ceiling above 40,000 feet, heavy cannons, sleek lines. But the dream ended in its first flight. The turbocharger failed before reaching altitude, the turbine cracking under heat it was never meant to bear. The pilot barely escaped with his life. The project was abandoned, another casualty of impossible ambition. Fumio Niiwa, the engineer who had once studied captured B-29 parts, watched the failure in silence. He later wrote, "Our knowledge was strong, but our industry was weak. We built ideas that our nation could not sustain." The skies told the same story. By autumn, American bombers filled the heavens over Japan. Every morning, their contrails stretched from horizon to horizon, glowing white against the blue. The Japanese people called them Shiroi Kumo, the white clouds, harbingers of destruction. Anti-aircraft crews fired blindly into the high air, their shells bursting far below the formations. Sergeant Shoji Suzuki recorded in his diary, "We could see them, but we could not touch them. Even when we hit, they kept flying." On the ground, the sense of dread grew daily. Factories closed, fuel reserves vanished. The empire that had once conquered half of Asia now stared upward, powerless, beneath a storm of metal. And yet, amid despair, there was a grim respect. Japanese engineers who examined the remains of downed B-29s were astonished. The turbine blades, polished, like mirrors, the bearings aligned with impossible precision. They represented a level of craftsmanship the Japanese industry could not reach under siege. Lieutenant Toshio Ota, a technical intelligence officer, wrote later, "Even if we had their blueprints in 1941, we could not have built them. Our forges would melt, our tools would break. The Americans had mastered the science of endurance." Above, the B-29s kept coming, from Saipan, from Guam, from Tinian, like waves that never stopped breaking. Each plane carried 8 turbochargers, each turbocharger a promise that the empire of the rising sun was setting for the last time. The air war was no longer a contest of courage. It had become a war of physics and factories. As one historian later wrote, men fought bravely, but machines decided. The truth that neither side could ignore was simple and terrible. The side that could build faster, higher, and stronger would prevail, and America's assembly lines had become more powerful than Japan's armies. In the fading light of 1944, the Japanese command finally realized the inevitable. Their fighters could no longer reach the bombers. Their cities could no longer hide beneath the clouds. The empire was suffocating under its own limits. And as the silver bombers vanished into the distance, their engines humming with cold precision, the meaning of modern warfare became unmistakable. In World War II, victory no longer belonged to the bravest. It belonged to those who could endure the fire and still keep flying. The night was still, heavy with the scent of rain and ash. Over the dark waters of the Pacific, 334 B-29s streaked eastward, a procession of steel and fire. Their commander, General Curtis LeMay, had changed everything. No longer would his bombers climb to 30,000 feet to drop precision bombs on hidden factories. Tonight, they would fly low at 7,000 feet and burn a city to the ground. It was March 9, 1945. The moon hung low, the wind restless. Tokyo slept beneath a sky that would soon turn red. Inside the lead bomber, navigator Captain James McNabb watched the altimeter drop. The crew was silent. They knew what awaited them, and what awaited those below. The bomb bay doors opened, revealing thousands of small cylinders stacked like metallic seeds. They were filled not with explosives, but with jellied fire. When the first wave reached the city, the bombs fell in clusters, bouncing once, then bursting into rivers of flame. Wooden houses, paper walls, the narrow streets of an ancient capital, all turned into fuel. The fire spread faster than sound, joining into a single storm that consumed everything in its path. From 7,000 feet, the crews saw a sea of fire blooming below. The heat rose in spirals that rocked the heavy bombers like toy boats on a tide. Inside the cockpit of Dauntless Doy, Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Morgan gripped the yoke as hot air slammed against the fuselage. "Keep her steady," he shouted. "We're flying through hell itself." Below, people ran through burning alleys, shadows flickering like ghosts. The air ignited, pulling oxygen from shelters and homes. Winds reached tornado strength, lifting roofs and bodies alike. The temperature climbed past 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than molten steel. 3 hours later, 16 square miles of Tokyo had vanished. Over 100,000 people were dead. A city of 10 million had become a memory of light. And through that light, the bombers turned for home. Only 14 planes were lost. It was, by every measure, one of the most destructive attacks in human history. Yet, to the men who flew it, victory tasted like ash. Sergeant John McLaughlin, a gunner on City of Los Angeles, later wrote, "We won that night, but I don't think any of us slept again." General LeMay's decision had been born not of cruelty, but of cold calculation. High-altitude bombing had failed to break Japan's will. At lower altitudes, the bombers could carry more fuel, more bombs, and strike more often. The turbo-superchargers that once lifted them above the clouds now eased their engines through the choking heat and thin smoke, allowing them to endure even the inferno they created. For Japan, it was the end of hope. Cities burned faster than they could be rebuilt. Fighter bases lay silent, their planes grounded for lack of fuel. Factories were rubble. The imperial heart that had once pulsed with ambition now beat weakly beneath layers of ash. Sergeant Shoji Suzuki, an anti-aircraft gunner stationed near Tokyo, wrote in his final diary entry, "We fire into the sky, but there is no sky left, only fire." He would die 2 nights later during another raid. By May, the B-29s came every day: Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kobe. Each city became another scar on the map. At night, the bombers flew home, their engines glowing faintly red in the darkness, each turbine whispering the same truth. The war was over, even if no one dared to say it. In the summer of 1945, the nightmare reached its final stage. On August 6th, a single B-29, the Enola Gay, flew at 31,000 feet over Hiroshima. Its engines purred steadily, each driven by two turbo superchargers, maintaining perfect pressure in the thin air. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. The world changed in a flash. 3 days later, another B-29 released its burden over Nagasaki. The empire that had once dreamed of ruling the Pacific surrendered to silence. In the aftermath, Japanese engineers examined the wreckage of war. They found the same truth in every turbine, every bearing, every polished surface. That victory belonged not only to soldiers, but to the science of endurance. Lieutenant Toshio Ota, who survived the war, later wrote, "Our defeat was not only military, it was industrial. We could not build what we dreamed." And so the war that had begun with ideals ended with equations. The numbers spoke for themselves. 200 B-29s produced every month, 1,600 turbochargers, precision-forged, balanced, tested. An empire defeated by arithmetic. In the years that followed, Japan rebuilt from those lessons. The same engineers who once struggled to forge turbines began designing automobiles, electronics, and aircraft that would astonish the world. They had learned the cost of imperfection and the price of peace. When the last B-29s flew in the Korean War, their silver skins dulled by time, the engines still carried the heartbeat of a vanished generation. Today, only two remain in the sky. When they fly at air shows, their deep, throaty roar echoes across the fields of America. Children look up, amazed, never knowing that hidden inside those old engines are the same turbo superchargers that once changed the fate of nations. The sound they make is not one of war anymore. It is a memory, a reminder that progress and destruction were once twins, born from the same fire, and that from the ashes of Tokyo rose not vengeance but understanding, the hard, bitter truth that the greatest victories often cost the soul of those who win them. When the engines finally went silent, the world could hear again. The war was over, but its echoes filled every factory, every home, every heart. Across oceans, nations counted their dead and wondered how the future could ever be built from such ruin. Yet from that ruin, something remarkable began. The technology that once burned cities became the foundation for a new kind of peace. The same engineers who had built machines of war turned their minds toward machines of life. Turbines that once powered bombers now powered airplanes that carried food, medicine, and hope across continents. Factories that forged weapons began producing tools for rebuilding. The same precision that had destroyed now healed. In the years after World War II, Japan rose from ashes not through conquest, but through craftsmanship. The lessons of defeat, precision, patience, and discipline became the pillars of its rebirth. And America too changed. The nation that had unleashed the most powerful engines of destruction began to ask a deeper question. What do we build next, and why? The B-29 Superfortress no longer flies in combat. But when the surviving planes roar across American skies today, their engines still carry the heartbeat of that forgotten truth. That victory has a cost beyond measure. Their sound is a hymn to every worker, every pilot, every soul who believed that progress could bring peace. The legacy of World War II is not only written in battlefields and monuments. It lives in the choices humanity makes when confronted with its own power. It asks us whether knowledge will serve compassion or domination, whether machines will lift us or bury us. Those who study the war often speak of courage, the courage of soldiers, of nations, of sacrifice. But there was another kind of courage too, the courage to rebuild, to forgive, to begin again. And as we look back, we must remember the fire that ended a world also forged a warning, because the next war will not be fought by heroes or villains, but by the decisions we make today. So when you hear the sound of a passing plane, remember the hum of the turbo supercharger, the small, spinning heart that once decided the fate of millions. Remember what it built, what it burned, and what it taught. Because in the memory of World War II, there lies both the shadow and the light of humankind. If you believe peace is worth fighting for, tell the world. Comment your cause below. Eliminate fascism. Fight for peace. Fight for justice. Fight for freedom. Fight for national independence. Because the war may have ended, but the mission, the fight for humanity, never will.